Well, good afternoon and welcome to our second session, the Democratic Nomination Contest here at the Dole Institute Politics Post-Election Conference 2008. I get to have fun this time. I don't get grilled. I get to grill these guys. So it's great to switch sides of the microphone. Let me make a couple of announcements right at the outset. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off right away. If you have a question at the end of the session, we'll try to allot 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please go to the microphone when we call for you to at the back of the room on this side of the room. And please do ask a question, no filibustering and no commentary. I'd like all of the panelists to please make a special effort to speak into the microphones. So you might want to pull those close together, and where you're sharing a microphone, please make sure that you're working with each other, the person that you're sharing the microphone with, so that you are speaking directly into a microphone. Let me introduce very briefly. You have detailed biographical information about all of our panelists in the materials that are available on the table outside. Let me very briefly run through and introduce everyone. First of all, my partner in crime, my co-moderator, our Democratic Fellow at the Dole Institute, Ray Strother, to my left. That's appropriate, isn't it, Ray?
That's appropriate.
Yeah, that'll work. Mr. Steve Hildebrand, the Deputy Campaign Manager for the Obama campaign. Mr. Matt Rodriguez, the Western Regional Director for the Obama campaign. My friend Kelly O'Donnell from NBC News. David Kurtz from Talking Points Memo. Geoff Earle, who we met before, who is somehow related to somebody here on staff at the Dole Institute, from the New York Post. Nate Silver, 538.com. Adam Nagorny, New York Times. Joe Trippi, who's been to the Dole Institute before, thanks for coming back, with senior advisor to John Edwards. And Elleithee, who is a senior spokesman for Senator Clinton's campaign. We will begin with, as we did on the Republican nomination, with a 5 to 7 minute introduction. We will, a pathway to victory by the three campaigns. We will go in candidate alpha order, which means Clinton, Edwards, Obama. So Mo, you're up first.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here today. I thought I'd start with just a very quick anecdote about how I got involved in Hillary's campaign, because I think it illustrates a little bit about what our approach was to the campaign. In the fall of 2006, I was squarely behind Mark Warner, former governor of Virginia, who a lot of people thought was going to run for president. I had worked for him on his governor's race and was gearing up to go join his young campaign when he pulled out of the race, surprising a lot of people. So I kind of sat back, didn't know what I was going to do, looked at the field, trying to figure out who I'd want to be with. And all I knew was that the two people I did not want to work for were Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Shows how much I know, right? With Obama, it was because I liked Barack Obama, I just wasn't ready to put my money on a horse that had never run a race before. And with Hillary, it wasn't that I had anything against Hillary. I just thought that, I like her, but I just don't know that anyone else does. She's just too divisive. She's too polarizing. That was the knock on her. And so I started talking to some of the other campaigns, but a couple of people from the Clinton camp approached me and said, why don't you at least come talk to us? And then after a couple of conversations, said, well, why don't you at least go hear her speak? And I did. And I ended up having what I ended up calling the moment. I sat there, I listened to her speak, and at the end of it I said, I didn't know she was that warm. I didn't know she was that engaging or that funny or that, in tune with folks. And if she can kind of turn my cynical view around, maybe she actually has a shot at this thing. So I went to work for her. And my initial job was running the state and local press operation, and then I eventually went on to become her traveling press secretary. I think a big part of what we tried to accomplish on this campaign and what we thought would help lead us to victory would be by really stressing not only her experience, because we thought that was our leg up, but also talking about how that experience was necessary to bring change. I think one of the misconceptions about the Clinton campaign, and I think a lot of our friends in the press corps early on like to make the Obama-Clinton dynamic one of change versus experience. And that was really never what we wanted to do. What we always knew was that this was a change election. There was no question about it. Now, ultimately, these guys did a better job of harnessing that than we did. But our approach was to say, okay, yeah, we can bring change too. We all can bring change. But who's the best person to bring that change, and what does that person need to do? And so we really focused on the experience angle early as a vehicle to bring change. We also knew that we had to give more people that moment. And so we tried to put Hillary in a lot of environments where she was interacting with people. For the first 2 months of the campaign, all we did were conversations with Hillary, these town hall formats where she would stay and take questions from as many people as she possibly could, to allow her to really be seen as engaging one-on-one with people. In Iowa and New Hampshire, as you all know, that's so important, that retail element. And our goal was just to essentially get through those first couple of early states, win them, and then we felt that if we could win those first few early states, we'd be fine. We'd be the nominee. We also knew, though, relatively early in the process, that Iowa was going to be a problem for us. And I'm sure we'll end up talking about that in greater detail. But we had a decision to make at a certain point. Do we want to keep focusing on Iowa or try to leapfrog it and go straight to New Hampshire? We decided, and Hillary herself decided pretty quickly, skipping Iowa was not a viable option for us. We had to compete there. But there were a series of missteps that ended up hurting us. I think our strategy was working well, probably through the end of the summer, maybe into the early fall of 2007. And one way to gauge that is if you looked at a lot of the polling, typically as a candidate's name ID grows, their favorable rating goes up, as does their unfavorable rating. But with Hillary, there was somewhat of a unique dynamic. She actually started with 100% name ID, and as the campaign progressed, her name ID went up and her favorable ratings went up, but her unfavorables actually started to go down. People were actually starting to like her more. She was changing some people's minds. But what we learned by the early fall was that was still very fragile. And after a series of missteps in the early fall, I'd say probably by October, early November, it started to fall apart, and Obama and Edwards really then were able to overwhelm us in Iowa. And once we lost in Iowa, we had the shocking come-from-behind win in New Hampshire, as my friend Matt and I were just recalling. It ended up being a bit of a back and forth in the next two states. So we were kind of tied going into February 5th and beyond. But at that point, it became pretty clear that if we didn't have a decisive edge coming out of February 5th, we were going to be in real trouble. That's what ended up happening. But I think our strategy was working well for a while. We just couldn't follow it through, and there are a lot of other problems along the way, which I'm sure we'll get into. So.
Okay, thanks, Mo. Joe?
Well, thanks for having me here again. My story's pretty short, actually. I joined the Edwards campaign as senior advisor in April of 2007. I joined on April 15th, which was the same day the FEC reports became public. So the next morning, one of the people, it might have been Gurney, first call I got was about a $400 haircut that I knew absolutely nothing about. I joined the campaign the day before. But the one thing that you recognized immediately was that the Edwards campaign at that point had built itself as one of the three big campaigns, which was a problem because it had staff everywhere in like 10, 15 states. I mean, Clinton and Obama had the resources at that point to build those kinds of organizations. The Edwards campaign sort of bought into the press thing at the time was there were 3 candidates who had a chance. Edwards might be one of them, and had just had a huge overhead at that point. And the first thing we had to do was just scale back as fast as we could without anybody trying to make sure no one noticed as much as we could. Which in the Obama and Clinton campaign, we're out there making sure everybody noticed that we were taking staff out of Nevada or where we were doing it, but we had to do it. We would not have lasted at all if we hadn't done that. And then I think, look, our strategy was really pretty simple. You had 2 historic candidacies in the race. We were the last white guy standing with a shot at the nomination in the Democratic Party to gain any. We weren't getting much press actually compared to the 2 historic candidacies, and the only shot we had was to beat them both in Iowa. That was it. I mean, it was basically we beat them both in Iowa. This thing might close. Let the press decide who. The press cannot handle 3 candidacies at one time for very long. It can't handle more than 2 for very long. It does everything it can to cut it down. So, we had to beat them both and then figure out who our opponent was. And the one thing we knew was that we obviously understood it was a change election. We thought if we were for a more populist change than Obama was articulating. Obama was clearly articulating change better than anybody in the race at that point, but there was an opening for us as a populist change agent, particularly in Iowa, and continue to sort of press Clinton as the status quo, an establishment candidate. If we could do that, we might be able to get by both of them and pull it off. I mean, that was our thing. Once you look at that strategy, though, and Clinton's got 400 paid staffers on the ground in Iowa, and the Obama campaign had a great candidate, an incredible field organization, not just in Iowa but in other places. We knew it was a tough uphill fight, but I think John Edwards went out every day and made it real tough, and I think scared a lot of the other campaigns a little bit about how fast we were starting to come on in Iowa towards the end. The one thing I'd say is I think one of the key moments was it began for us. We went into the yearly Coast Convention determined to paint Clinton and to trap her as a status quo candidate. And we went in with the notion that if we could press her on taking lobbyists and PAC money, that we could get her to defend them. And if we could do that, it would be very tough for her to come across as a change candidate the rest of the campaign. And John Edwards went into that debate, and he pressed, and Matt Bai turned at exactly the right moment and said, he's got a legitimate point, will you continue to take that money? And she said, yes, I will, because they're good Americans too, or something. I'm not trying to paraphrase it, but she did exactly what we thought she would do. And that helped, I think, if you then start to watch those 3 or 4 debates, culminating with the 4 answers to the 4 different questions, to the driver's license question on the Spitzer stuff in New York. That's where I really think there was this slide of Hillary Clinton, not as a change candidate, but with the press's help. I agree with you. Pushed her to the status quo. She comes in 3rd in Iowa. 2nd, close in politics doesn't count. The only shot we would have had was to win. We didn't do that. I think then as you sort of go on, the only other shot we would have had probably is if she'd somehow come in 3rd again in New Hampshire. I mean, somehow that wasn't in the cards. We knew that. The whole press was immediately going into the Obama-Clinton battle immediately. Even though we took 2nd, we got really no coverage or anything out of it. So we had to come in 1st. And then I think the only real other impact, I think we had a considerable impact. A lot of it was, I remember when Edwards put his health care plan out first, and Hillary had sort of talked about not having a specific plan because that would be because she'd learned from the first mistake. He put it out there and people beat up on it. Then the Obama campaign put theirs out, and then Edwards ran around for a month screaming that Obama's, my plan's much better than Obama's, but at least he has a plan. When's Hillary going to put hers out? And then I think he just kept pushing on issues like health care, poverty. I mean, I think we had an effect on the debate, but in the end, after South Carolina, it was over for us, and you guys ran a hell of a campaign.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Steve, Matt?
I'll take the first shot. Bill, thank you. It's good to be here at the Dole Institute. I grew up in George McGovern's hometown, and he and Senator Dole are very close friends. He was certainly my mentor getting into politics. And I also worked for Tom Daschle for a long time, and same thing, such close friends. So it's good to be here as a Democrat. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the lead up to Barack's announcement, because we were sort of the non-traditional entry into this campaign, the surprise announcement. In the early fall of 2006, Barack really wasn't serious at all about running for the presidency. It was sort of, very much in the back of his mind. Most of his advisors were saying, this might not be the right time. We really got to take a look at this, but, the probability isn't great. A lot of people on his team were saying, we'll take a hard look, but I would bet in the end that he doesn't do it. We went out to, Senator Harkin invited Barack to speak at the annual steak fry that he does in Iowa, which is sort of a place where potential candidates and Gore and Clinton both spoke there. Hillary spoke there in the past, but it was a high-profile deal. A lot of press, a lot of national press showed up for it. Barack worked the audience for about 3 hours. He was incredibly mobbed. People were just hungry to touch this guy, and it sort of lit a bit of a fire at that point. And then leading up to the 2006 November election, he was the most requested speaker to go out and campaign for Democratic candidates, to raise money for them, to get out the vote events for him. And the crowds were shockingly large. It was nothing that we necessarily predicted. At the same time, he was doing his book tour for the Audacity of Hope. And again, the book sales were incredible, and the crowds at book signings were ferocious. So we started to think that maybe there is something out there, and that we should take a hard look at this. There were still people on our team saying, I bet in the end he doesn't do this. So I believe it was the day after the election in 2006, either the day after or 2 days after, I don't remember, where about a half a dozen of us gathered with Barack and Michelle and their two best friends to have a first real session to talk seriously about this, to look at initial budget, look at initial fundraising plan, what a schedule might look like in taking this guy away from his family, a staffing structure, some of those initial things that you do. And Barack is a serious person, as well as Michelle, as we've all become very aware. And they weren't going to take this decision lightly. They were going to make sure that any of their advisors, any of us, were very serious about putting together a real planning effort before they would make any kind of a decision. So we did a handful of those meetings leading up to the family's annual vacation to Hawaii, where he said, I will make a decision between Christmas and New Year's and let you all know. They came back from Hawaii right after New Year's, and no decision was made, leading us, should he actually decide to run, leading us a little bit behind in the fact that the first primary is not the Iowa caucuses, it's the first fundraising period at the end of March. And what we didn't want to do is start this campaign and have days go by where we couldn't be as prepared as possible to make sure that those first 3 months of the year were maximized. So he made the decision, I think around January 10th or so. We filed initial papers for an exploratory committee and said at that time that we would announce a specific date for a formal announcement. We had really no staff. We had really no national fundraising community, so to speak. We were very much at a disadvantage, except we had a great candidate, and we had some people around him who were very committed to try and make this work. We made the decision that he would formally announce outside the Capitol in Springfield, Illinois, and we made the decision that even though it was more than likely going to be a freezing day in January, that we would do it outside, and we would work very hard to build a big crowd. And about 15,000 people showed up for that initial announcement. He gave an incredible speech, and he really set the tone for the kind of candidate he planned to be. It was very much I want to fight for the people of America. I'm not going to take money from political action committees. I'm not going to take money from Washington lobbyists. I want to work towards change. We have to change the way Washington works, or we're never going to solve the difficult problems that we're facing in America right now. He laid down the marker on the Iraq War, the fact that he opposed it from the beginning, and that his judgment was better than others. And it really tried to set the stage between judgment and experience, as well as experience versus change. I know my time is coming short. I want to just say a couple other things that I think are important. At the end of the first quarter, we sort of shocked the political establishment by just barely beating Senator Clinton in our fundraising for that first quarter, and raising about 12 or 13 million more than we ever expected we could raise. It shocked us just as much as it shocked anybody. And then at that point, we really started to get very, very serious about preparing for those first 4 contests in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina.
I know we want to move on. I just want to say, I think a candidate like Barack's been actually, a guy who could actually win the primary has been coming for a while. I mean, there have been candidacies, Gary Hart in '84, McCain in 2000, I wouldn't say Buchanan in '96, but who sort of catch a moment. You know, when do you catch lightning in a bottle, and how long does that last? But one of the advantages that I think our candidacy had, which Steve alluded to, was a lot of, even Howard Dean actually in 2004, they tend to, it's like building an airplane as it's flying, and we had to as well, but we had a lot of resources early. I mean, Gary Hart wasn't on the ballot in a lot of states in '84. He just couldn't catch the wave. Whether he would have won or not, I don't know. McCain, the same thing. He had all this money coming in. He was going up against just an enormous juggernaut, larger juggernaut against Bush probably than was Clinton relative to us. But I think with the internet, with Barack's obvious enormous talent, it allowed us to build a sort of first-class campaign with great staff. And not that these other campaigns didn't have that, but we were able to really put the whole package together early through those summer months with a candidate while we were catching fire who was, it was, I think, a phenomenon. I get tired of hearing that term, but he is obviously a unique talent. And I think when you add that together, we were in a very good position to build around a candidate of really singular talent and ability. So.
Okay. We have a number of prominent journalists, members of the new media, and Nate, I think I'll refer to you as our cephalogist, if that's acceptable, because that's the best word I can come up with. What were your assessments of this race, the Democratic nomination fight at the outset?
I mean, I wrote incorrectly. Well, maybe it was correct at the time, if that counts. That Hillary Clinton was the, leading candidate for the nomination. This would have been late in 2007, and I quoted Joe Trippi and on your side, David Axelrod, talking about what a great candidate and how she's a front runner and how good the candidate is. And the fact is, she was. in my opinion, had Barack Obama not been in the race, don't hate me for this, okay, she would have won the nomination by February 5th, okay? Sorry.
No, she would have.
Okay.
No,
The two things she ran up against, and she was a really good, I covered her as a Senate candidate, I watched her grow, she was a really good candidate. Her campaign, that's another thing. But she in the face of you guys, she faced an extraordinary candidate. I've been doing this for 30 years. Obama's was the best candidate I think I've ever covered, just in terms of pure appeal, just intellect, able to sort of command an audience. I mean, he's just really good at this. And you guys, at this point, this doesn't make a difference for me to suck up to you guys anymore because the campaign's over. You guys ran a great campaign. You guys understood how the world was changing in a way a lot of people, no offense, your age and older, did not understand. Understood fundraising, understood demographic trends, understood communications, understood the internet, and you saw that every day, and you were willing to take chances, and you're always way ahead of the curve, which is only to say that Hillary Clinton lost the race, but she lost the race against the kind of candidate that comes along and campaign that comes along, I think, every 30 years or more. So
I think Senator Clinton had some different challenges because when she became a senator and she was still trying to shake off what does it mean to have a first lady enter politics in this way, and at a time of war, she had sort of the Margaret Thatcher issue. Could a woman be commander-in-chief? Very different threshold that she had to sort of surpass. And her more hawkish side was well developed, and at that time, that was helpful to her. You could never run out of just the pure benefit that no one could ever get back to 2002 when Senator Obama took his position on the war. There was no way to ever undo that because he had a moment and he made a decision, and that judgment proved to be one that many people in the country came to also hold. So I think the thresholds they had to meet were different. I think Senator Edwards, who I also covered in 2004, especially in 2004, he was new and he was that sunshine and he was also skillful as a speaker. But when he joined the ticket, was then later viewed as not as effective and perhaps may have been harmed by that to some degree. And I think, especially in television, we are, for good or bad, we are drawn to what is new, what is unexpected, and that becomes part of the narrative. And the entire country certainly knew Senator Clinton. And I think the moments you're talking about, those personal connections, those are so real, but they don't necessarily translate in print or on television because you can't see the entire moment play out, and the intimacy isn't quite there, with the exception of the big New Hampshire moment. Mm-hmm. So those skills that she has and that surprise that people always remark about those other dimensions to who she is, remained largely unknown unless you attended her events. And so without even getting into all the discussion of the skills of your candidate and his grace and his time, I think those other kinds of dynamics had an effect in how they were covered.
I'll jump in. I think Clinton's biggest problem is that even though I have no doubt that she wanted to bring a number of changes, and all the people working for her did, she was identified with the status quo, and I don't think there's much she could have done to not be that candidate, although I think she improved on that as the campaign went by. I mean, as we say, she had 100% name ID. She was associated with a very unpopular war, which was dominating the news at the key early months of the cycle. She would often, she'd have an event and she'd trot out, in order to prove her experience and show her ability to lead. She'd trot out, would put 30 generals behind her sometimes, or people, all the faces, the people who are now going to be running the country in the Obama administration. But to attest to her seriousness, and she's a serious person, she would bring out all these faces from the Clinton administration, and so I think I think she and her campaign did pick up eventually how much yearning there was in the electorate for something new. She wasn't the person to deliver that. And then I also think I agree with what Mo said in that Clinton was I think a much better candidate than her initial reputation once people got to see her in a small environment. And that's something that she and her campaign eventually figured out, although I think belatedly. But she was still the inferior candidate, and that's we talked a little bit about this on the Republican panel. I mean, one of the key if not the main ingredient to a successful presidential campaign, is have the best candidate. And she just, she was outclassed in almost every way, just in the performance aspects of it. And those crowds that Steve was talking about for Obama, I mean, he was getting, from the very beginning in Iowa, in small towns with low populations, people would want to come out to see him, even if they weren't sure they were for him. So he had a much better opportunity than almost anybody else to try to make the sale with those people.
Can I react a little bit to that?
Please.
You know, in the early research that we did, polling and focus group work that we're not supposed to talk about, we were certainly, you know, we certainly had a very, very narrow circle to get through. You know, our first poll that we did, I believe, had Barack at 12%, and John Edwards, I think, was at 38%. This was in the Iowa caucuses. And, you know, that's a long ways to go. Now, granted, we had a year to get there. Our early focus group work, you know, there was a lot of positive anecdotes. We like what we hear coming out of his mouth. We liked that speech in 2004, but we don't really know anything about him. When you talked about his background, they would sort of say, we like it, we're not sure that makes him ready to be president. You know, these others have so much more experience. This country's in serious trouble. We need somebody with experience. Yes, we want change, but we don't know what kind of change he's even going to bring. A couple of not surprising in some respects, but, you know, sort of disturbing things that came out of one of our focus groups before the first quarter of 2007 and one of them after. In the first quarter, and these are both in Iowa, there was one person in the focus group who said, you know, we're not sure who he would surround himself with if he won the presidency because we don't know anything about him. Is he going to surround himself with Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson? You know, that was they just didn't know, right? And then after we raised that 25 or 6 million, whatever it was, after the first quarter, a comment from one of the focus group participants in Iowa said, you know, where did all that money come from? Did he get it from the NAACP? You know, so we had that sort of racial undertone that we had to get over. And while we had great crowds, in large part it was because he was interesting, intriguing, and he gave a great speech. And as you said, Geoff, it wasn't because they were showing up to support him. You know, we were hyper aggressive about getting people who came to our events to sign up to support Barack, and a very, very small percentage in those probably the first 6 to 8 months actually signed a supporter card, as aggressive as we were to try and get them to do that.
David, Nate, you guys have any comments on this before we move?
Well, for me, I think the most interesting month of the campaign might have been, you know, November 2007, where Mo talked about the kind of missteps that Clinton had. There was kind of the unforced error during that debate, the immigration line that Joe talked about. But then it was like every other day, something was going wrong in the Clinton campaign, whether it was the, you know, incident up in New Hampshire where the circuit called Obama like a drug dealer, basically, or, you know, now the fun part starts, or kindergarten, or, you know, Mark Penn having a bad appearance on Hardball. You know, what went wrong in that month where, I mean, obviously they knew that Iowa was going to be closer than the national polls were at that moment, but, you know, somehow Obama got in their head and they began to play into his hands. So it's not really a comment so much as kind of a question, kind of, you know, ponderable for later on.
I was just going to second Adam in that I got all this wrong in the beginning as well, and I feel like I should preface that just in full disclosure. I didn't think
it was right at the time, David. It was right at the time.
It was right at the time. It was Hillary's race to lose, and I didn't think that Obama would be able to knock her off. I didn't think that either one of them would be very strong general election candidates. I frankly thought that John Edwards presented the best option for Democrats in the general, which, as we now know, would have been an utter disaster. So
thanks for pointing that out.
It only took half an hour.
So with that being said, I mean, I think one of the things that Hillary faced was in being the well-funded candidate of the Democratic establishment was that not only did Obama represent change rhetorically, but the fact that his people were a little bit more on the outside of the Democratic races generally, that they were able to be more daring, to do things that literally were different and represented change, whether it was the fundraising, whether it was the online presence, the social media that they were able to utilize. I think all of those reinforced for people, especially for the press, the idea that this was new and that it was different and that it wasn't just about talking about it, but they were literally doing it on a daily basis in the way they were running their campaign. And I think that that had a huge impact, especially early on in the race, and obviously continued as it became just a juggernaut of a fundraising operation. None of that would have happened, frankly, without the internet. I mean, I don't think that someone with his lack of name recognition and with his lack of a fundraising base would have been able to do it 4 years ago or 8 years ago.
I love being moderator because I have personal opinions and no one to say anything. I'm fascinated by Howard Dean. And I think Howard Dean sort of kick-started the Obama campaign. He was very controversial. He's always been controversial. And except for Donna Brazile, I can't think of anyone who defended him when he wanted the 50-state strategy. Would all of you or any of you discuss how Howard Dean's 50-state strategy helped or hurt your campaigns? Start with Steve.
Certainly at the beginning, there wasn't much of a correlation, but as we moved into Super Tuesday, I believe it was 22 states in the end that moved their primaries and caucuses up to Super Tuesday, and it was an unprecedented day where this just wasn't a group of southern states. These were states all over the country, all different kinds of states, and no one strategy was going to win those states. We made the decision in about June of 2007 that by August and September we would have staff in every single one of those states and prepare for that February 5th contest. As we did that, we made a pretty big deal out of it with reporters and with pundits. There was a lot of skepticism. We can't believe you're putting staff in Kansas for a Super Tuesday caucus. In some respects, we looked at the Howard Dean 50-state model and said, if you're going to compete, you have to be there. And that's a lot of what Howard Dean believes, that it's not just presidential politics where you put staff in battleground states, but there's a lot of other important races, Senate, congressional, gubernatorial, and state legislative races that we got to compete at if we're going to grow this party. Then the other thing I would say is in May of 2008, we made the decision to go into all 50 states with a very aggressive voter registration drive because we had volunteers. After fighting 50 state primaries with Senator Clinton, we had a huge base of volunteer support in every single state in the country, and they were all asking us, well, what are we supposed to do? And so we put them to work with a pretty rigid and structured voter registration drive and modeled it in some respects after the Howard Dean 50-state effort. And then finally, going into the general election, the fact that we were going to dramatically expand the map beyond the typical battleground states. Again, we made a big deal out of it. There was a lot of skepticism for us doing it. People said, why are you in Indiana? Why are you in North Dakota? Why are you in all of these states? And part of it was because there was a real opportunity to win. Part of it was because we wanted additional strategies to get there that didn't have to include Ohio and Florida. And part of it was we had the money and the volunteer resources to do it. And I guess fourthly, we wanted McCain to have to spend money in those states.
Mo, you didn't get involved in the 50-state strategy. Was it a mistake?
Well, look, I think, at the time, a lot of people said, we're particularly, from my friends who are in the Obama camp, that the length of the primary was, not being helpful, right? There were a lot of people that were saying, come on, Hillary, get out of the race. The longer you stay in this thing, the more you're hurting the party and hurting us as the eventual nominee. I actually, maybe this is my sense of self-importance, I actually think the fact that we took it to the distance made the party stronger and allowed exactly what Steve was just talking about, for an energized Democratic base of both Obama and Hillary supporters, that they were able to tap into, that the McCain campaign was not able to enjoy the same sort of luxury of having such a motivated group. So I think, in that sense, the party's 50s. I'm sorry?
It was selfless?
Yeah, exactly. No, but I do think that it was incredibly helpful to the party that we did compete, and that for the first time in modern history, we had a competitive primary in all 50 states. Look, there's no question the Obama campaign out-hustled us in the overall in the primary season. I think on the ground, we probably lost this race, this nomination in February, in the month of February. I think up through February 5th, it was a tie. We split the first 4 states, and we essentially split the February 5th states. Starting with March 4th in Texas and Ohio, through the end, Hillary actually won more votes, more states, and more delegates. But we got crushed in the 11 straight losses in February. It's because these guys saw it earlier than we did, and they put boots on the ground earlier than we did. I knew we were going to... I first saw signs of trouble, personally, in October, when I was sitting at my desk in D.C., almost singularly focused on Iowa with a little bit of a focus on New Hampshire, wondering when I was going to start focusing on Nevada and South Carolina. And suddenly I'm starting to see press clips about Obama campaign activity in Georgia. That was a February 5th state. I was like, oh my God, they're already focused on that in October. David Plouffe was doing conference calls with Georgia reporters. At that point, I knew we were going to start having some trouble, in the later states. We just never got there, and they did. And hats off to you guys for that.
We also, we benefited, Barack benefited in a significant way, having to compete so aggressively with a tough candidate in 50 states. Because he was brand new, it made him much more battle-tested, and it built a base of support that we wouldn't have gotten if this would have been a traditional 3 or 4 state contest that ended. And, we're better going into the general election with Ohio and Florida and every one of these states because we had to fight those states.
But Mo, why didn't, Harold Ickes, who drafted the delegate rules in 1980, or I guess the big question is why didn't the Clinton organization anticipate this a little bit more? Because not every campaign had the resources to be in so many states at once, and you've got to shepherd them, and you can't afford to get blown out, obviously, in Iowa or an early state. But why wasn't there more of an emphasis, even if you didn't recognize it on January 1st, 2007, why not in October? Why wasn't there a massive shifting of resources and placing of key staff in every state?
There was a sense internally, which at the time was not a crazy notion, that this thing was going to be over on February the 5th. One way or the other. We might not win. We recognize that. We might not win, but it was going to be over February 5th, one way or the other. We also knew that we didn't want to come in 3rd place in Iowa, so we had to put a lot of resources into Iowa. That was our worst case scenario. Unfortunately, that was realized. But the amount of resources and energy it took to fight in Iowa, and then to come back in the next 3 states and have enough of a structure for that pseudo-national primary on February 5th with the 20-some states that were voting on that day. That's where our heads were. And, again, my hats off to the Obama campaign for taking a look at the next step. Now, I don't know whether they were visionary to see past February. I remember the first meeting I was in when Harold Ickes said, guys, it was right after February 5th, and we started looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, this thing is going to have to go all the way to March. And Harold Ickes looking at us and saying, you guys are crazy. It's going to go to April. And, we thought, oh my God, April, how could that be? It just, we just missed it.
Well,
See, my understanding is that you guys, also thought that, or Plouffe did, that the race was likely to end on February 5th, but you were smart enough to set up, what was it called, the after February 5th room in Chicago, and you planned ahead. They also had the benefit, I think this is part of it, of having more money. And then going to your original question, because I was watching this as it was going on, I think what Dean is doing for the party is probably good long term, but I remember having conversations with Plouffe, probably concurrent to when Beth talked to that person at Harvard, who was like, we are now, this is not a bad thing. We're setting up primary organizations in every state. We have the money to do this. We're going to be able to compete in states that you're not going to believe. And him saying, like, in, I think, May, that you guys are going to be competitive in Indiana and North Carolina. So I think that was really what was going on here in terms of the expansion of the map.
Well, and you also asked about, getting back to Dean, we were going to take a lot of credit for it because we won. But it also partly, there's a lot of social networking that was going on as well. I mean, we were going to these states in the primary, and there were organizations already set up when we got there because people were finding each other. And I think we spent a lot of money on that, and that was a big part of it. But it would have put enormous pressure on the Clinton campaign. To just say, well, the Clinton campaign should have done everything that we did. We were going, and we would show up, we would have staffers, 25-year-old kids going to meetings of 300, 400 people who've been organizing their community for months. I mean, there was an element here there was a wave that sort of overwhelmed the Clinton campaign. So to say they should have just put all these people in would have cost $300 million.
That was the most interesting thing for me to watch, was to understand that what was happening was you guys had all these people's social networks building themselves. They're actually paying you guys to pay the organizers that interacted with them. For Hillary Clinton to build that, I mean, since she sort of missed that step of creating this, sort of creating that energy, which I think she could have, but didn't do, was a disaster for them because there was no way you could pay to do it. I mean, you try to do it in Iowa by putting 400 organizers on the ground, paid people on the ground to make up for that lack of energy for it. It got her third place. So, but the big mistake was, I mean, when you look back at it, it was the caucus states. It was just not competing there.
But Adam, I want to follow up on your comments. We spent an incredible amount of time around a large conference table in our Chicago headquarters with, each of these states up on the wall and, going through all the February 5th states. There were 7 of them that were caucus states. We knew that we had the capacity to organize in those caucus states better than Hillary's campaign. And they were the first states that we put staff into of the 22. And then we started putting staff into the other Feb 5 states. And I think all the campaigns were trying to figure out on February 5th, what are the press and pundits going to say, who's the winner? And, is it going to be the popular vote? Is it going to be the number of states won? Right. Is it going to be the number of delegates won? And we felt in the end that it was going to be some combination of states won and delegates won, with probably delegates won dominating. And so going into those 7 caucus states, first and foremost, because they take more organization than primary states, and because we were better at it, at least we thought we were, was such an advantage. And in almost all of those cases, Senator Clinton's campaign chose to not compete as hard as we were competing.
Yeah, it wasn't just you competed. You understood proportionality. Right, in other words, you understood if you win under these crazy DNC rules, if you win by a certain point, if you win by a lot, you get a lot more delegates, which you understood, and I don't think the Clinton people did understand. So as a result, you racked up more delegates by winning by big margins in caucus states there, and then over the next 11 states. That's where I think I agree with you. That's when I think the race was lost.
Well, and I'm curious because there has been a lot of reporting about the Clinton campaign not being as aware about the proportionality issue. At what point internally did you all realize that they weren't realizing it, that they were in the dark on that? Was there an epiphany moment where you thought
Nevada was the 3rd state in the country to vote, and it was a caucus state. And many of you in the press were reporting that Hillary Clinton won the Nevada caucuses because she won the popular vote. Well, caucuses aren't about the popular vote, they're about the number of delegates won. And I will take no credit for this. because I was hiding out in South Carolina at the time. Our very smart delegate tracker, Geoff Berman, and Matt Nugent, and David Plouffe sat there and said, you know what, we won one more delegate than she did. We immediately called a conference call with reporters, and Geoff Berman got on there and talked this through as to how we won one more delegate and the fact that we came across winning Nevada. There was definitely a perception that she won it, but in the end, because it was a delegate battle, we won Nevada.
I want to cut this question off right here, but with one question I want you to answer only with a nod of the head. Looking back, will you concede that it was Joe Trippi that was really the father of the Obama campaign for introducing new politics?
Let's move along. I
did nod.
I think the point that...
Can I just say one thing? I mean, the one thing that happened over and over again as I ran around out there were the thousands and thousands of kids that did start in the Dean campaign who came up to me and said, I'm working for Obama or Edwards. They tended to be mostly Obama, but Obama or Edwards. Not many Clinton, but there were some. But it was great to see them all out there. A lot of them working on that campaign. They're the kids that started it.
Yeah, I think as Ray pointed out as Ray pointed out to me a couple weeks ago, the genius of the nomination campaign was really one, that you understood the caucuses and that you could get delegates there, and two, that you understood what Adam said about proportionality.
Try to explain.
But there's one other issue here that I wanted to bring up, Steve, that you touched upon in your opening comments. You talked about money. You talked about being able to match Senator Clinton. Essentially, it was roughly dollar for dollar, I think, in that first quarter. Even though she transferred $10 million from her Senate account, push that aside, money actually raised for the presidential campaign. Did you guys know after that first quarter that this was going to be a huge advantage for you, A? And B, I'd just like all of you to comment about, what points in the campaign, if any, did you come to where money factored into decisions about where you were going to play and what tactics you were going to deploy?
Well, our first fundraising, we felt the first quarter we had to raise $12 million to be viable in the eyes of the press and the pundits. That would more than likely put us in the top 3 or 4 of the candidates in terms of raising money. Our first finance plan was not $12 million, it was $9 million. We really couldn't see more than $9 million coming in that first quarter. We started to go out and do these large-scale rallies in Atlanta and LA and Cleveland and Austin, Texas, and other places. And we started to really build a small donor network. And yes, Joe Trippi gets a lot of credit for some of the modeling that we did to try and get there. We had no intention at the beginning of that quarter, or frankly in the middle of that quarter, that we could come close to Senator Clinton. It was really probably in the second week of March where we thought, we potentially are going to blow this up pretty big, but we also knew that she was raising a lot of money. Going into the second quarter, I will give David Plouffe a huge amount of credit for a guy who's never been a fundraiser. He was as smart as could be about projecting income each month, each quarter of the campaign. There was only one month that I know of where he was off, and that was January of 2008. After we won the Iowa caucuses, he thought maybe we could raise another $10 million that month. We raised a total of $55 million that month. So he wasn't off in a bad way. But, he was the one who said, about 8 weeks before we started the general election, put together a spending budget based on $475 million, and I believe we exceeded it. But all of us knew that was an incredible amount of money to try and raise, and we were all pretty nervous about it because we actually started, you don't just, put together a $475 million budget and then in October you get to spend it all. We were spending very seriously starting immediately after July 4th, where we went into, I believe it was 18 states and started pretty heavy media buys. and had very large staffing operations. So we were committing early money pretty seriously, but Pluff knew how to budget this stuff out and project income better than anybody.
Do you ever recall a time during the nomination phase of the campaign when you guys made a critical decision based upon the lack of money? Or were you always pretty well funded in that respect?
I mean, John Carson, who was our national field director at the time, and David Pluff and a few others were pretty remarkable in that while we were projecting good income that we could expend, the money was just coming in and coming in and coming in. Our supporters were, generous if we won and scared and generous if we lost. And they just kept giving and giving and giving. And so in a lot of respects, it was the best of all worlds, where what we needed to do was be prepared to spend a lot of money in a short period of time to be highly competitive. And so we were constantly adding to a TV buy, constantly adding staff, constantly adding short-term workers, paid phones, more mail, I mean the whole thing, but it had to move quickly. And it was really, after Feb 5, it was really an election or two or three every single week. And it was hard and complicated, and our field staff were getting very tired. But I don't think there was really a point where we had to make spending decisions based on not having enough. We were very fortunate.
Oh, Joe?
We,
sure you did.
We spent the entire, I mean, it was tearing down Nevada, tearing down New Hampshire, tearing down every state that we had anything in to, in a campaign that had to win Iowa to have any shot at living. And given what both of these campaigns were spending in Iowa, I mean, I don't know if we know yet what you guys spent, but I mean, it was like a lot more than we probably all that we had raised in the entire campaign, these guys were both spending her to take third. So for us, it was scavenging everything down to just be competitive organizationally. We still really weren't. I mean, we had a lot of legacy organizers from the 2004 campaign, so there was an organization there, but we could barely keep Iowa going and stay competitive. And we could always get Elizabeth to call Ann Coulter and drum up $300,000 in internet money to fund a couple more staffers. We did that a lot. I mean, so we were kind of living off the net too, but nowhere near obviously the success of Obama, but enough to look. We don't have complaints. We had a competitive shot at Iowa, and they beat us fair and square, and that was it. But yeah, money was a huge problem for us, obviously, as it was for these guys.
Yeah, I mean, money ended up becoming an issue for us. It was one of the reasons, I think, why our February strategy wasn't as robust as these guys. But I'll tell you, one of the most remarkable moments of the campaign for me was right when the news got out that Hillary had made a personal loan to her campaign. Money started pouring in. And everywhere we went, people would come up to her on the rope line and say, "I'd have given sooner if I had known you needed it. I'd have given sooner if you had just asked." And that was a huge wake-up call. That was something these guys got pretty early on. People aren't just going to write to the check if you don't ask for it. And there was just this sense of this Clinton fundraising juggernaut that most people thought it was taken care of. And suddenly, so many of our supporters started writing the same kinds of small checks. Now, by no means was it Obama scale, but we were doing all right from that point forward. And from that point forward, every time Hillary took the mic, she said, "Go to my website." And there was a prominent ask there.
And that's one that I read wrong. I remember when that news came out, the $5 million loan. I mean, I thought that was just humiliating to have to do that. She had to reach into her own pocketbook, and then it was front page of every newspaper, and then it just poured in. And it kept pouring in through the long slog when she would win or lose, when she would lose.
But she didn't do it for that reason, right, Mo? It wasn't strategic.
I wish I could say that was
Let me be
strategic
clear.
foresight.
Yeah,
but-
okay, yeah.
That's,
It's an awful expensive gamble.
It's only
But
Mark
that-
Penn who lost out.
That insight alone may be the whole thing, the whole reason she lost. I mean, in the end, had somebody realized a year earlier that if you just asked, I mean, the difference, because she had the ability to do that, and I remember, we were way out of the race by then, but I remember in February when 35 million came in that month for her this year, and I remember if they'd been doing that from the get-go, it would have been a much more. I don't know. Maybe they would have had the money to compete in caucus.
I absolutely believe, and I give all the credit in the world to the campaign that these guys ran. I honestly believe that Hillary Clinton had the same sort of passionate support behind her that Barack Obama did. Absolutely.
But it didn't get tapped. Is what I'm
But
saying.
they just tapped into it better than she did. And they had a campaign that served their candidate, I think, better than she did in tapping into that.
What would you have done? What would you have done differently in Iowa, in retrospect?
Wow. I mean, look, I think, the trajectory of this campaign was one where we were holding steady through most of the spring of 07, summer of 07, even into the early fall of 07. We were holding steady, and I think everyone else was kind of stalled. No one was really breaking through yet. And as I mentioned earlier, I think her numbers were actually getting better, but it was still a little fragile. And I think there was probably 3 or 4 moments in November that turned things around. Some of them were small, some of them were real, some of them weren't, some of them were media-driven, some of them weren't.
What were they? Can you
The
enumerate?
first was, I remember this because it was the day I arrived in Iowa for 2 months, was the story that broke about Hillary going to a diner in Iowa and she didn't tip the waitress. And it was like a 2-day long media brouhaha. Never mind that it wasn't true. And never mind that the restaurant management came out and said it wasn't true. But it was the first time we took a real hard media beating on something like that. Second thing was the Philadelphia debate with the illegal immigrant driver's license issue. And that was maybe the first debate where the press said Hillary lost this one. The third one, which was maybe one of the more damaging of them, was the planted questions at the town hall meeting in Iowa, which was an overzealous young staffer thinking he was going to help out the boss by planting a few positive questions for her. Now, anyone that knows Hillary and followed her knows that Hillary does not want planted questions. Hillary will take a question from anyone on any topic, and more often than not, can handle the question. She can hold her own. But when that story broke, that ended up really just exploding, and it reinforced everything people thought they didn't like about her. That she was not genuine, that she was willing to say or do whatever it took to get elected. Never mind that it wasn't true. But it really reinforced a lot of the negative stereotypes and undid a lot of the goodwill that she had built up. So these were a couple of incidents, and that third one I think was maybe really one of the more damaging ones. And it wasn't even her, which was sort of the shame of it all, was that it wasn't her mistake. But it just reinforced a lot of the negativity and really gave, I think, both other campaigns a series of openings to just run right up the middle and blow past us.
Well, 2 of the 3 you mentioned were beyond her control.
Were beyond her control.
And were so damaging.
Yeah. And the third one, the one about the debate answer, I've always thought it was interesting how the media handled that. She took a beating for it, rightfully or wrongfully. She took a beating for it. Senator Obama gave a similar answer the following week at a debate. But they were able to pivot away from it a lot better than we were able to pivot away from it. And so they didn't take the same kind of incoming on that one on that issue. Not to say that they didn't get their fair share, But on that one, I don't think they did. So, I don't know. I don't know what we would have done differently in Iowa, other than avoid those mistakes and do a better job of some of our messaging. Look, the Hillary Clinton from March on was a different Hillary Clinton than the one that was on the national stage up until then. She moved away from the experience message and was really delivering more of a populist message, similar to what John Edwards had been doing, which is kind of where she had been all along.
Something we should have been doing.
But people saw it. People were seeing her as an advocate for them as opposed to an advocate for herself. And I think that was when they turned. And she really just ran away with those last 3 months. Just ran away with the race. It was just too late.
Right.
Well, Mo brought up debates. Wow. Mo brought up debates, so the next question, we had a lot of early debates. How did they affect the race? And I'd like everyone to participate in this. How did the early debates affect the race?
I don't think much at all, Earle. I mean, in my opinion, I think they just reinforced everything that was going on in the race, which was she was head and shoulders above everybody else. I don't think it was until the Philadelphia debate that there was a real seminal moment. And I think, just to get back about the debates, I think it was feeding into, actually, I think, a problem with the narrative that the Clinton campaign had created for themselves, and which they were very fortunate with us to let us remain the underdog and scrap for a long time. And I think when they, had sort of declared themselves, and I know that not everybody within the campaign agreed with it, but it's sort of inevitable. I do think that was a problem that when the stuff that Mo was talking about started happening, some of the press problems that they have fairly or unfairly, it was eating away at something. Even Al Gore, who might have been as large, maybe in a larger prohibitive favorite in 2000, never went quite that far as saying that I'm going to be the nominee, or it was all about experience, and I think that it ended up sort of like pulling her down. But I think, for at least, I don't know what Steve's take is, but I thought most of the debates really were I don't think that effective for them.
Matt, they probably helped her. They helped her at the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about there was a gathering perception that she was getting stronger and better because of the debates until the debate you mentioned, which I think which was devastating. What I would argue with that, I don't want to jump ahead to the next session. What I would argue is where the early debates made a difference was in the general election, because one of the reasons that Barack Obama did so well, I'll be really quick here, in the general election debates with John McCain is because he went through 36 debates or whatever, right, with Clinton and Edwards.
Yeah, but I think on a macro level it had a much bigger advantage for Obama, in part because of how unknown he was and because of his race, that sort of exposure for that long, I think, and the fact that he didn't really screw up any of the debates. I mean, he was a very consistent performer. I think lowered the threshold of concern that a lot of people had. I mean, I think that level of exposure was a big advantage for him, even though the particular debates might not, any one individual debate moment might not have made a
I agree, difference. Except that we were not, but there was a long period of time where the debates were actually hurting us. I mean, people, they were reinforcing Hillary as this behemoth. Like, I was state director in New Hampshire, and we weren't getting the candidate a lot. It was, the race ended up being Iowa, so we had, basically, it was a nationalized race. And the debates were just saying, I think most of the analysis out of the debates was Barack wasn't that strong in the debates, that he was struggling, and that she was just so far ahead of everybody else on stage. So I do think over time, I agree, by the general election, I think it helped him enormously, and I think being on stage with McCain gave him that credibility, that one last threshold to jump over. But I think for a long time, I don't think they ended up hurting us. We won, but I don't think it was helping us. It was absolutely helping her for a long time until she struggled with that one debate. So when I say they weren't that effective, I think we ended up ending up where we wanted to. But I think we were struggling in them for a while.
Did you go back and study some of the debates where he meandered a bit and had some trouble with that in order to convince him to tighten up, which he certainly did later on?
I never tell Barack how to do the debates, but no, Barack, as we've all seen, is an enormously deliberative guy, and there's no question that actually, I know Steve was part of that, but he knew that he could do better, and he is a guy who's constantly improving. So yes, I mean, he spent a lot of time, how can I be better at this? He knew he had to be better, and I think he did get better over time.
Just one other quick comment. There were debate requests coming out of, everywhere. When you fight a 50-state primary, every single state wants to have a debate, and, each of the major networks were constantly asking so on and so forth, right? The Clinton campaign would accept everything. We didn't want to accept anything because we knew that it would take, Barack 2.5 days down for preparation for, the actual debate and take it away from New Hampshire or South Carolina or Nevada or one of the February 5th states. And it would drive us crazy when Hillary would say yes and yes and yes, because we wanted to say no and no
and then
and no.
we would say yes because we needed any exposure we could get. So as soon as she said yes, we'd say yes, and that every time made you guys, because if we had skipped and some of the other guys had skipped, you might be able to get out of it.
You said no by fall, though.
Yeah.
Really fun.
And I've got a question about how Obama approached the debates, because having to sit through at least 17 or 18 of those god-awful things, sometimes it was very frustrating, because we all know he's a smart, articulate guy, he's a lawyer, he's got the training for this kind of argument, and it often seemed like he was not trying to score the most points or even win the debate. He's just trying to get through the thing. And Hillary, and sometimes, actually, I think Edwards often scored the most, rhetorical points in the debate. And Obama's just kind of hanging back there. How would you guys approach these things?
Well, in some respects, every candidate goes into a debate with a first principle of just getting through it and not screwing up. Winning it is obviously great, but so oftentimes there's never a decisive winner. Ours wasn't so much that Barack was, or the team was concerned that he would screw up. It was more the fact that he had a different style than the other candidates. He tended to, the serious nature of this guy, not that the other candidates aren't, but he is deliberative, and short formats are not good for him. It's why we pushed constantly to try and do, longer format interviews, whether it was 60 Minutes or Larry King or, whatever. We spent too much time going after the morning shows, and we should have, we realized later on that, we needed to really work hard to get long format interviews because it was the best format for him.
We're going to move to audience Q&A in just a moment, but I have one more question, or Ray may have one more question. Was there a double standard in the media coverage based on gender in this campaign, in this contest?
I had a moment in the spring of '08 where I was sitting on the Hillary bus, Lord knows what state we were in, and there was some media story broke, and it was just so upsetting to me. And it dawned on me, something that really, really upset me personally. I realized I was a bit of a sexist. And I didn't know that I was before this campaign. And it's because there's certain behavior that I saw on this campaign that I never thought twice about before this campaign that I began to see in a very different way. And it's little things. The number of times reporters would comment on what Hillary Clinton wore, but you never saw they never wrote about what Barack Obama or John Edwards wore. Other than the infamous,
John Edwards at the debate, thanks.
Other than the infamous, YouTube video of John Edwards getting his hair blown.
He also did the one where he asked her. He asked her about her.
He did. That's right.
Liked her dress or something. I can't remember,
Right.
but it was bad.
Yeah, the hairstyle being different. The 2-day-long story about Hillary Clinton's cleavage on the Senate floor. Time after time after time, stories like that were being written, or commentary like that, and it would just sort of get glossed over. I think that had something to do with New Hampshire, with what happened in New Hampshire. The fact that when Hillary Clinton had a genuine moment, it was portrayed as emotional, as opposed to, which is a bit of a charged word, I think. We saw a rallying of women behind her that I think surprised everyone, including us in New Hampshire. I remember being at rally after rally in state after state with middle-aged women holding up signs that said MSNBC with a circle and a slash through it. Sorry, Kelly. And, hearing them yell at the press on the riser. I remember Geoff being there for a couple of those, yelling at the press on the riser in the back because they thought that she was being treated so unfairly. I don't think that's why we lost. And I would never give that impression. We lost because they ran a better campaign. But it didn't stop with Hillary Clinton. I am no Sarah Palin apologist. But I was appalled when the story came out about whether or not Sarah Palin could be vice president while having a newborn. And could she do that with those children? No one asked that of Barack Obama, who has two young daughters.
Wasn't the issue though that she had that her daughter had a daughter out of a 16-year-old kid had a kid out of wedlock? One of her kids had Down syndrome. I mean, it wasn't simple. I remember that story. I'm sorry, because I remember people complaining about it. I don't want to turn this into a media thing. That story was written by a woman. It was quoted only women. I never even thought of the idea. The only people I've heard complain about that story are men. You and Howard Wolfson. Okay.
I'm not saying that story was purely media driven because I don't believe it was purely media driven. I do believe
it seems like a legitimate point.
I do believe that there are a lot of, and I don't want to turn this into a media bashing thing.
Why not?
Because there'll be plenty of time for that later.
We have 2 more sessions for that.
Right. But I do think that there is a conversation about gender that this nation needs to have, I guess is my point. And I don't think we settled it in this campaign with either Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin. I think we came a long way, but I don't think we settled it. Not to say that we settled the conversation on race either. But I do think at times there was a double standard. I do think at times she was treated differently than her male counterparts. And
Didn't she exploit that, though, saying, I'm your girl, and doing all these... I mean, she would say that.
She didn't do that.
I don't think that's much different than, candidates saying, I'm your guy.
No, but I mean, didn't she? She tried to appeal to women. She did not hide her.
No, she did not hide it. But I think what she said.
That's very different, though, than being in some way subtly demeaned. As a woman, not speaking for NBC News in any way, shape, or form, I think having that discussion is very important. And one of the things that I always try to do is to refer to her as Senator Clinton. You branded her as Hillary for obvious reasons, to distinguish her from the former president and all of that. But people will, and even here, it's Obama and Hillary. She's referred to by her first name. So is Governor Palin, who I always try to refer to as governor. I think those things happen because it's a reflection of society. It comes right then into the media. And I can tell you there were lively conversations, especially among my female colleagues, trying to point out some of these things, trying to give just a different view of how the same circumstance would be viewed. And it just needs to keep going. And I often had women who attended events come up to me and unload all of their concerns about whether it was Senator Clinton or Governor Palin. And because I was with John McCain for so much, many Hillary Clinton supporters were coming up to us and talking to us, or I would wade into the crowd and speak to them. So I think these things are really worthy of looking at, gender and race, but that perception, I think, existed, and I think that, like any other part of the society, we should be scrutinized for it and have to, take a look at ourselves and how, in the power of the media, those messages were sent.
Okay, let's move to our Q&A from the audience. Chelsea, do we have somebody back there?
My name is Michael Smith from Emporia State University. And one of the things that really came out, I thought, in this campaign was that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are two very different people with different skill sets and in some ways different values. And I'd like to get the panel to comment on that and any impact you saw of that on the campaign.
Well, my joke was that if Hillary lost, she should come back in 2012 as Hillary Rodham. I think Bill made it harder for her to be a change candidate in certain ways, especially when it looked like he was kind of maybe out there not with the best intentions exactly either toward Obama or arguably toward Hillary herself in some ways. But they got a lot of good out of Bill too. I mean, in some of these states, later on in the process, he would just barnstorm and go to small town after small town for days on end, and that was very valuable. I never looked at it quantitatively, but you get a lot of extra votes out in some of these states, and it helped him, I think, in the Pennsylvania's build a somewhat wider cushion and stuff like that. So, the low-profile bill was good. I think that high-profile, what you see on MSNBC, CNN bill wound up being damaging.
I think, I think Bill Clinton was an asset, is an asset. I think if he was damaged or damaging, I don't think the Obama campaign would have utilized him as a surrogate in the general election. I remember they sent him to places like Roanoke, Virginia in the final weeks of the campaign. Not typically Democratic-friendly areas, but they sent him in because they knew that he could do some good. He did a tremendous amount of good for us in the primaries, and I think your point about how locals were receiving him versus how he was seen in the national spotlight is a good one. He got very different coverage at the same event from the national press than he did from the local press. Democratic activists loved the guy, and I think they were excited to see him, and he was still the best surrogate for her and the best biographer of her. But there were those key moments that you referenced where it would dominate the national story and end up being a bit of a distraction from the message we were trying to push. But a lot of times you didn't feel that on the ground. And so I think ultimately he probably helped more than he didn't.
And I think just from our point of view, I still think and we saw this definitely with the speech at the convention, and a little bit what like Mo was talking about on the ground, there's just no one in American politics, and I'd argue maybe even Barack, who makes the case better than Bill Clinton. I mean, I thought his speech at the convention, he distills the argument of what this race was about, and what Barack's election, or a Democrat's election, was going to mean for their lives. He is still, I think, just head and shoulders above anybody who's able to do that, and I think you saw that with his speech there, and he was doing that throughout. There's no one who makes the case better, and regular voters who come to see someone who's going to make a difference in their lives, whoever the president's going to be, I just don't think anyone comes close to his ability to do that. So I think it's hard to look at him as not as an asset.
Yeah.
And his failure, right? I think his main one is that he's failed to change with the times and appreciate how new media has changed things. Where he probably thinks he goes to a place like Roanoke, he's incredibly persuasive and effective. He probably thinks he's won 50 votes, but then he pops off and he says one thing, and it's a national media story which might cost him 50 votes somewhere else.
Okay, next question.
Judy Harrington from Lawrence, and previously from South Dakota. So I had a question for Steve. You developed your political organizing career from one of the smallest states in the country, South Dakota, and I wonder what you feel what advantage that was, or what you learned there that you may not have, or that was different from had you grown up in California or New York or Florida or Texas politics.
Well, those first four primaries, and to some extent a lot of the the February 5th Super Tuesday states, were incredibly important to having a strong field operation, and I think all of the candidates recognized that. I started in 1986 with Tom Daschle when he was first running for the U.S. Senate. 6 years previous to that, I was an 18-year-old volunteering on George McGovern's final race, and McGovern was the grassroots guy. But in the Daschle race, he was a congressman trying to beat an incumbent senator who had beaten George McGovern. And we thought we could take the race close, but we never thought we could win without a strong field operation. And it was really where I started learning that field, and it was my first, race. That field really mattered. We were able to dramatically increase the turnout on the Indian reservations in South Dakota because of field. We raised a lot of money via the field. We had what we viewed as a very large paid field operation. I think we had 12. When I ran the Iowa caucuses 14 years later, we thought we had an incredibly large field operation with 80 paid field organizers, and during Barack's campaign, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 at the end. I mean, all the campaigns had very large field operations because they knew it mattered. And going into the general election, we knew that it was going to be very difficult to win the general election if we didn't go out and register hundreds of thousands, millions of new voters that we could bring into the process. And my own very remedial look at the general election results, I very strongly feel that there are 9 states that we won that we would not have won if we would not have, through our field operation, through our volunteer efforts, registered those millions and millions of new voters. If we would have lost those states, we would have ended up with, I believe, 244 electoral votes instead of the 365 that we won. And obviously you need 270. So that field effort with voter registration, you know, I learned it, Judy, back in South Dakota, so.
Okay, we have time for one last question from Mr. Ed Quick, who is a former Democratic fellow here at the Dole Institute. Ed?
Thanks, Bill. You mentioned the question of race came up early on when the Obama organization was thinking about the campaign and how you were going to confront it. It didn't go away. I'd like for you to explain what the reaction was to Reverend Wright and Bill Clinton's comments in which he was viewed as trying to marginalize Obama by saying he's just another Jesse Jackson. Those were two things, and Clinton, Hillary Clinton apparently had a very high standing among black voters right up a very long time, and then it went down precipitously. Also, would you comment, is Mark Penn the next Bob Shrum?
We'll let Joe answer that.
Am I supposed to take this one? We had our own problems with African American voters going into this. Our early research with African American voters specifically suggested that with higher income, higher educated African Americans, they would support him, they would want him to be successful. With lower income, lower educated African Americans in all pockets of the country, they had skepticism that white voters would ever allow him to become president, and they were also incredibly scared about his security. And in some respects, there was consideration not to support him because of the security question, which was, you know, sort of disturbing going into this. From a perspective of how we had to deal with race, how we had to deal with Reverend Wright, you know, we knew before Barack's announcement back in February of 2007 that Reverend Wright had some potential problems that could be related to us in terms of some of the things that he has said. And while he meant a lot to Barack early on, as time went on, he got to be pretty hot. And, you know, there was consideration given that he participate in one of the early announcement events. After we did our own hard look at him, we chose not to do that. You know, it was one of those things where everyone expected this candidate, as we all try to do it in politics with every candidate, which is to own the people you're associated with. And we had a bucket load of them. I was down in Miami in the last 4 weeks of the campaign, and I was asked to a very unfortunate event with about 90 rich people who were supposedly undecided or leaning. And the last question came up where this guy said, I want to read you a list of names. And I knew what he was going to do. And he goes, Reverend Wright, William Ayers, Resco, and on and on. And it was like, God, we're a week out and this hasn't gone away. So I think race was an undertone throughout the entire campaign. When Newsweek magazine does 3 or 4 different either cover stories or large stories on race, as well as obviously it was constantly invoked in the press. It was always going to be part of this, and we didn't have to figure out how to be white. We had to figure out how to be right, and I think in the end we were on the right side of the issues, and race mattered less, except when you go in and look at some of the election results. In a place like Virginia, I believe we lost the white vote by 23 points. In Pennsylvania, where everybody thought we were going to have our biggest problem with white voters, we only lost the white vote overall by 4%. We actually won independent whites by 15%. So it was very geographical, but it was certainly something to deal with throughout.
Any other comments on that? Okay, we will break at this point. Everybody, please enjoy the reception and dinner. Please do start lining up about 6. We may prod you a little.